Hi guys. So I haven't published in ages because, well, boating is so difficult. I had a few some more technical problems with a monitor, and it's Christmas, so there's all that crap that we have to deal with. Yeah, just general duties and responsibilities can overwhelm us sometimes, and YouTube kind of comes last, doesn't it? So today I wanted to maybe try and start a series of videos about some books that I read, that I don't really talk. There's so much that I want to talk about, and then I make all these notes, and then I start trying to write stuff to put into a book, to compile, and then I publish a few articles to forums, this, that, and the other, and it's amazing how unproductive I feel, because I used to just pump out videos all the time, and to be honest with you, I kind of regret some of what I used to publish, because now I just see most of it as just like a stream of consciousness, not on this channel, or say within the last 2 years where I got into philosophy properly, but certainly I'm much more cautious about what I put down as for material. So I wanted to and what this leads to is me producing anything in the end half the time. I'm just reading and reading and reading and reading, because there's a whole world of ignorance that I have towards the stuff that I'm into. So I want to make sure if I publish, it's I understand it myself, and that it's of interest. So I wanted to provide a summary of the first essay in Nick Land's Fanged Noumena, which is a book which is understood to be a kind of a collection of writings on a kind of cultural phenomenon, a way of speaking, a speech act of some kind, that's both constantive and performative, called accelerationism. And I'll be doing more on speech acts soon, because speech acts are where I think the continental schools and the analytic schools they can come together. They're on the same sort of page, and I don't see the gap between the two to be anywhere near what people exaggerate them to be most of the time. But speech acts from John Austin, where he's talking about a constantive speech is sort of a descriptive kind of speech, and performative speech is a kind of creative speech. So speech isn't something that's just said, it does something as well. Okay, so that's the first sort of principle that I think is important before getting into these post-structuralist thinkers such as Deleuze and Derrida in particular. So the first text in Fanged Noumena is Kant, Capital, and the Prohibition of Incest. Okay, so you got 3 things in the title there. So Kant kind of represents the Enlightenment, okay, values of modernity, etc. And capitalism is the economic system that sort of appears around the same sort of time as Kant, Rousseau, Locke, Hume, Smith, around this economic system called liberalism, and economy and politics sort of become the same thing in a way to sort of undermine the oppressive levies of the monarchy, but also to assimilate them, the aristocracy and the merchant class, together to form a government, and also to undermine any kind of resistance from anarchists or communists, or, you know, all sorts of different alternatives are out there. You know, it wasn't just anti-monarchy or anti-feudal. You know, there was all kinds of different resistance out there. And then you got this thing called the Prohibition of Incest, which is something that's studied at length with the structuralist anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. I published a video about a month ago about the prohibition of incest, about how it's a cultural taboo, a cultural phantasm, really. You know, it appears to be natural, but really, when you look at it, it's actually a kind of duty bound to the rule, in much the same way that we think of Kant. You know, the categorical imperative, that if I will it, if I write down an imperative, my duty is bound to the rule because I believe that it's the right thing to do, you know. So it doesn't matter about it being a natural law or not. It's just, if my rationality, if my reason using deontic logic says that what to write down logically, then my duty must be bound to the rule of logic. So the moral responsibility is to be logically consistent, something like that. So what Kant's doing here is, what Land is doing by talking about these three, a philosopher, an economic system, and a cultural duty bound to the rule, if you will, is he's talking about incest prohibition with liberalism, in the sense that liberalism says, you know, it tries to come across that it has this tolerance for the other, that it will respect the truly other, the radical alterity. But Land says that this is nonsense, that actually what capitalism does is that it incorporates, it assimilates, in the same sense that capitalism assimilated the monarchy and the aristocracy. It wasn't that much of a radical change at the top, but it was a strange idea from the bottom up. But what it does is that it kind of it assimilates and recuperates itself. And the way that it does that is that it requires you to accept rules of exchange. It colonizes. It's the driving force behind regimes of imperialism. And so it doesn't respect otherness. So that means that in terms of the prohibition of incest, okay, which says, you know, you don't sleep with your kin, the father makes a law which is, you know, don't sleep with the daughter, don't sleep with your sister, this, that and the other. So it keeps them protected as the other. The feminine is the other, the radical alterity. But on this wide scale of things, capitalism incorporates, assimilates, makes everything the same, and it doesn't really respect, you know, the truly other. You know, there's a quote right at the beginning of the essay, which is from Lévi-Strauss, which effectively says, you know, marrying a black man, like someone, you know, like a Maasai warrior or something, someone who's got a large disc in his lip, and, you know, someone who's radically other. Okay, nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying that we tend to keep to our own, don't we? You know, when we think in terms of colonization, we don't respect those differences. You know, people say things like, oh, well, if foreigners come over here, they should learn our language. So we don't respect the differences. You know, we don't go over to other countries and learn their language. That never happens. But somehow there's this, you know, double standard, if you will. And he says, you know, this prohibition of incest, that capitalism and liberalism respects difference. It allows for the exchange to take place with that difference in mind. Land says this just doesn't happen, it's bullshit, stop describing it in that way. It completely assimilates the other and makes it the same. So Levi-Strauss has got this view of food, you know, in pre-state society and agricultural systems, where you have rich food and you have poor food, and the farmer, won't eat the rich food that's there to sell on the market, you know, but he will eat the poor food, which is like grain and things like that. But if he produces fruits, you know, like, I don't know, blueberries, something that would be, you know, very desirable on the market, he will sell those and eat poor food so that, you know, he can make some money, basically. You know, you have to sort of go without in order to make some money in the long run. And so Land compares this with the prohibition of incest from the father. You know, I'm not going to sleep with my daughter. That's there to exchange with other people's brothers and fathers, you know. So he's saying they are gifts to be exchanged in exchange for these riches, but can't be consumed by the father as they are his, you know, best produce kind of thing. So, you know, he talks about this prohibition in terms of as if it's like honey or blueberries, as they're valued on the market to be sold. So what he does here is show how the cultural phantasm, the prohibition of incest, the taboo that we have towards inbreeding, actually emerges at the same time which we think in terms of market value. So that's why, if duty is bound to the rule and be logically consistent, then markets have always been set up from the cultural phantasm of the prohibition of incest. So the incest prohibition is supposed to keep a boundary from the same and an openness to the other as a marketplace. But Land observes and he describes this process of assimilation which violates the prohibition of incest, and he sees the resistance. Then he's talking about resistance projects, as you have to if you're talking about the lineage and genealogy of Kant and Capital from the Enlightenment, you know, from the fall of feudalism into capitalism and other various possibilities, including communism, including anarchism. He says that even they, you know, are not radical enough. They're not touching the root of things enough to tackle how deeply ingrained this hypocritical prohibition of incest. This hypocritical prohibition of incest, fraudulent morality, if you will, about the rules of exchange. He's saying there's nothing out there at the moment that is radical enough to overcome it. That all of them have been assimilated fundamentally by this duty bound to the rule, the categorical imperative of capitalism, of the market being the controlling force of human life. It makes everything the same. So the other never truly materializes. He says the closest that you've got to the most radical is, militant radical feminists who, in other words, if women all got together and, got the guns, got the swords out, cut all our dicks off, stuck us underground, and completely overrode the, like in the South Park thing where they said, oh, they're just going to stick us underground and make us write jokes and milk us for a semen. That kind of thing. He's saying that's as close as you get to being truly radical enough to override this hypocritical, patronymic, owned by the father, patriarchal, cultural speech act and norm, this constantive yet performative at the same time, prohibition of incest. So he says that's as close as it gets to being truly radical enough. But the Marxists and socialists and anarchists, whatever alternatives there are, they all have this problem of being hypocritical about the prohibition of incest. They've all been assimilated, and they continue to assimilate in the same way that capitalism works. And this is where the acceleration theme begins to sort of arise out of Land's text. Because there is no other to interact with. There's no bearer of alterity left. We're just kind of being dissolved into the process of capital. It's making everything the same. This is the beginning of the dawning of capitalist realism. And so alterity vanishes into the process, and so he picks up on tones in Deleuze and Guattari in the sense of acceleration, that affirming the all-assimilating, all-consuming of the other process of capitalism and liberal free markets is the means to get to radical change and revolution. Okay, so he's talking about some kind of radicalism that is imminent to the process of capital itself. So he's saying because the sameness, once we get over the hypocrisy there, I think what I took from this, to be honest, is that capital requires at least some illusion of resistance to be, in the Chomsky sort of vein. It needs resistance in the form of communism to say, look, I've got something that's better than this. But when it's constantly assimilating, there's no prohibition of incest because it's constantly consummating with itself when it makes everything itself, in a kind of narcissistic dispersion, then there is only enclosure. There's nowhere else to go, So instead, it becomes nihilistic. It becomes a drain upon itself. And so, in a way, Land just says, well, if I affirm the acceleration of the process, then that might lead to radical revolutionary change, because he's talking about something that is incredibly radical to the issue about the prohibition of incest, about duty being bound to the rule, about capitalism requiring to assimilate and recuperate like a contagion, in narcissism and dispersion. And the next essay, which I've got to read and fully understand, is about Heidegger and his 1953 interpretation of Georg Trakl, an Austrian poet who alluded a lot to incest with his sister, who died of a cocaine overdose. It talks about progress being ultimately destructive, about there being expectations of success, but Trakl fails at everything, but he's successful as a poet, a truly other in society. But I'm going to just sort of leave it there because I've got a lot more to sort of cover in that essay. It's a very dense text, as it's talking about the way language works from the Heideggerian view, tones of animality, etc. So there's a lot more I've got to do, but the very title, Narcissism and Dispersion, is where we're sort of leaving off from this text, Kant, Capital and the Prohibition of Incest. So he undermines the apparent virtues of liberalism which emerged during the Enlightenment and Kant. It looks to use reason and truth to bound duty to the rule, and he tells a story that says capitalism is a liar. It's a narcissistic force in the socius, of the socius. And this is why the book's entitled Fanged Noumena, that there's this ever-present power of the abstract, of the metaphysical, which is a construct that bites its victims and it makes them be the same as they are, like a vampire. So it excludes this true alterity. And so narcissism and this dispersion is to land, a form of vampirism. So, yeah, it's an extraordinary text, horrific in the way that he sort of explains, this incest thing to be a hypocrisy. And, he's saying, well, he puts one thing forward from Levi-Strauss and from Land, where he's saying, someone with a disc in the lip from a tribe in, I don't know, somewhere off a very remote island from Africa or New Zealand or whatever, some unearthed tribe, that's the truly other over there. But if capital went over there, it wouldn't respect the difference. It would transform them from free animals, humans out in the wilderness, one with the animals, the truly romantic, in the sense that it would be equal in nature, would actually be in nature. That isn't possible if there's capitalism. Capitalism is cultural. It starts with the idea of property, labour, appropriation, these sort of things, so it doesn't respect difference and diversity. It has to bite its victim, make it the same, and after a bit it is, inbreeding. It's just, that's the way that he sort of visualizes the whole process, as one big inbreeding mutant of some kind, But, yeah, any thoughts? I just thought I'd sort of leave that with you, see what you think about that, and as soon as I think I've got a means of conveying the Heideggerian charcoal into to you. In the meantime, please feel free to visit the forum, it's in the link below, and you can also support me on Patreon as well. Okay, Happy New Year, and I'll try and be a bit more active.